How do you follow that amazing session with another one, of course? We all know that customers are at the heart of everything we do. So this time round, we'll be discussing a need for feedback, giving the customer what they want. Let's dive right in.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back. Welcome to the session. Today, we are joined by some fantastic speakers, so I'm really looking forward to it. Just before we get into the content, I will just remind you of a few little pieces of information. So, firstly, our Slack community, that's where our community lives mostly. It's got 7,500 other product pros in there. So do come and join us. You can go to productledalliance.com and they'll have pages on there where you can jump off, join the Slack community. It's completely free and it's really useful resource for everybody. There's a product leadership channel in there as well. So lots for you to check out. As well as the Slack community on Product Led Alliance, you'll also find lots of content, courses. We've got white papers, articles, research, loads of useful information on there, as well as our membership options too. So do be sure to check that all out while you're there. Now, if you would like to join us in person at a CPO summit after this festival, we are actually going to be in London in just a few weeks' time on December 1st. So if you're going to be nearby, we would love to see you there, and you can get your tickets. You can jump off again from productledalliance.com. So without any further ado, let's jump into the next panel. As our little intro video said there, and it's a really interesting topic. It is a need for feedback, giving the customers what they want. So I'm going to invite our speakers to join me on the stage to turn their videos on. And whilst they do that, I will just reflect that I think I hear all the time how listening to your customers and putting their needs and delivering value to them at the heart of what you do is so important. So I think this will be a really, really interesting topic for us to kick off and to explore. So let's do some intros. Shall we come to you first, Alex, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself and telling us a little bit about yourself.
I'm not sure we heard you well, James.
I was just saying, would you mind doing a little introduction to yourself, Alex?
I can help. Yeah, of course. Hello, everyone. I am Alexandra Lang. I'm based in Paris, and I'm an advisor and coach working with different product leaders in order to help them accelerate their growth and also have more impact. I also do interim CPO roles in some cases with clients, and until pretty recently, I was CPO at Uptime, an IoT startup here in Paris, and just before I was a CPO at Signature, a Signature B2B group, and before that, in charge of product for Airco, one of the latest French unicorns.
Great, thank you. Lots of really useful experience to draw on, I'm sure. Sam, if we come to you next, would you mind introducing yourself?
Sure, love to. I am the accessibility evangelist here at Fable. And so as the accessibility evangelist, I think and talk a lot about accessibility for people with disabilities. And that's kind of a wider grouping of folks than we often think about. We sometimes think about, disability as some small thing that only affects a few people, but it's much wider than that, and it affects all of us. And at Fable, that's really what we're about, is helping folks integrate not only the wants, but the needs of people with disabilities into the product management and ideation and research and development process.
Great, thanks, Sam. And Dylan, if we come to you next, do you want to tell us a little about yourself?
Yeah, thanks. My name is Dylan Casey. I'm the Chief Product Officer at Reef Technology. And we're essentially a proximity network and currently have a primary focus on ghost kitchens. And before that, I was the Chief Product Officer for engineering at Goldman Sachs, and also did some time at Yahoo, and essentially like to say that I grew up at Google. So I've kind of had a diverse set of product surface areas, if you will. And I'm currently in Miami at our headquarters, but I'm based in New Jersey. So a little bit of travel here and there.
Great, thanks, Dylan. I'll try not to be too jealous of you in Miami. I'm based in Scotland, so slightly different climate, unfortunately, for me. And last but not least, Mike, do you want to tell us a little about yourself?
Sure. I'm Mike, speaking to you out of Zurich, Switzerland. I'm CPO at a company called Small PDF. Previously, I was COO at Typeform and held similar sort of product leadership roles at Leanplum, Wango, and NativeX. And I started at Nokia over 20 years ago. I've recently learned that starting 20 years ago with a PM title is somehow amazing. Most people didn't even know that PMs existed 20 years ago. So I'm maybe aging myself, but yes, I've been doing PM work now for 20 years.
That's great. Thanks, Mike. Thanks. So let's kick things off. Before we do, I've got some questions that I'm going to put to the panel, but we also want your questions as well. So be sure to drop any questions you have into the chat box. You don't need to wait, and just pop them in there as and when you think of them. We'll maybe weave them into a few questions if they're relevant, if you're picking up on themes we're talking about already. But a lot of the time, we may just keep them to the end and go through them all in one quick fire round towards the end of the time. So drop them in there as you think of them. With that, my first question is really about the two types of feedback. So we can have quantitative feedback, coming to us through data, and we can have more qualitative feedback that our users provide to us. So really, I'm interested in how you all go about combining and balancing those two different types, between what priority do you give them, how do you bring them together. So I'd love to explore that. Dylan, I don't know if you would mind kicking us off on that one.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think I've been on this kick for the last couple of years, where I kind of almost see everything as a funnel, and it's a framework that helps me understand what a customer or a user goes through in order to solve some sort of problem, where the product that we're providing is essentially the answer to that problem. And so one of the things that I like about the framework is that it makes us focus on the customer, but then also forces a level of empathy to understand what steps do they have to go through. And so it's an interesting way to both look at qualitative and quantitative data in a way that gets you to the same endpoint. So this framework is something that's really been useful in a lot of the different scenarios that I've been in most recently. And it's applicable to both, kind of transaction funnels where, there's some sort of checkout function. And it's also like very relevant in a very kind of consumer user perspective as well, because ultimately, as a product manager, you want your user to get to a certain place at the end of the product experience. And so I think anchoring on that outcome and then working backwards from that, and then using data, both quantitative and quantitative, is a great way to understand where the customer is potentially having a problem or it's actually working quite well.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, thanks for that. And Sam, did you have anything that you wanted to share about that kind of balance between quantitative and qualitative feedback?
So I think it's really interesting when we're thinking about both the quantitative and the qualitative data, is making sure that we are combining these two types of data in ways that don't drown the needs of some folks out kind of at the expense of the wants of other folks. Because there can be a desire to sort of take all of this data and quantize it and average it. And then what tends to happen is the voices of some of your less common users who, there may be fewer of them, tend to get averaged away a little bit. And just because there are fewer of them doesn't mean that they're less important, or doesn't necessarily mean that things that fix or that see to their needs won't make things better for everyone. And we can sometimes see that a lot in that we'll prioritize a nice to have feature for one group of folks when there's still another whole group of folks who can't access the product at all, whether it's because they're somebody with a disability, or because they're on a low bandwidth connection, or because they're on a smartphone and we're prioritizing desktop. And what we also find is that when you are collecting your data, whether it's quantitative or qualitative, you tend to be collecting data from people who are already at least somewhat satisfied by your product. And so you're not hearing from the people who would love to use your product but can't, because there is some barrier or there is some piece of friction that is keeping them out. And so we tend to have this vicious circle of, well, these people aren't our users because they can't use our product, but they're not our users, so we're not going to collect data from them. And so it's really important to think about, when we're thinking about whether it's quantitative or qualitative, how we collect this data. And then once it's collected, how we combine it in ways that actually help us prioritize creating a good product for everyone.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And there might be a question, if we have time, there might be a question a little later on about how we actually gather that feedback from people who aren't necessarily using the product. But one thing I wanted to follow up on there with you, Stan, was how do you go about identifying what is a need and what is a want within your data?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting question. I mean, the first step really is figuring out what are the barriers that are either keeping people out of the product or that are preventing them from accessing certain functions of the product. It's really important to, first of all, think about access and think about making sure that everyone can get the thing done with the product, right? Because that's a need. Often, I think sometimes too, we think of our products as maybe, I don't know, luxuries or optional things in a way. But a lot of products in the digital world today, we can legitimately say, I need to use this so that I can work, so that I can interact with my government, so that I can have my medical care, right? These things are no longer optional. And so the first thing then really is making sure that everyone has access and that everyone can achieve their goals, as opposed to sort of, thinking about, well, something that will make something a little bit easier for one group of people and not benefit another. The problem that we hit there is sometimes things that are ease of use features for one group of people are really needs for another group of people, right? If you think about, for example, the ability to talk to your support via text chat, that's really great for those of us who just don't like talking on the phone, but it's also a need for folks who may be deaf, things like that.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, thanks for that. Alexandra, just to call back to the original balance between the quantitative and the qualitative, how have you approached that in the past? How do you balance those two sources of feedback?
Yeah, usually the way I see the quantitative feedback is a lot about the impact as well, like really kind of knowing the numbers and measuring the impact, and the qualitative feedback more about understanding the why behind users' motivations and getting more nuances around what they use, what are the needs, what are the problems. And I think in some cases, like a lot of cases, I can see this starting maybe from more like a quantitative point of view, like experts that a bit as, Dylan was talking about the funnel, like X% of our users are dropping at this moment. So sometimes you do start from more this like quantitative point, and you need to understand the why. So you're going to go and dig a bit deeper into understanding the why, the motivations, needs, and so on. But then whether you, and it's the same with like sometimes you start from quantitative of like you want to increase engagement or retention, whatever definition you have for your activation maybe, or an objective. And once you understand the whys and motivations, then you can go back to thinking about a solution, and then you kind of circle back to more like a quantitative approach where you need to be like, okay, I need quantitative data to show me and to run a lean experiment really fast and show me if this can work or not. So I think this is a like one of the ways, but we always like mix it. Like in some cases, it can also start from different, more like qualitative feedback, and see what impact these could have if we implement solutions linked to this. And also something that I've seen in the different companies I've joined, I think it's a lot about even having access on all these types of feedback, qualitative and quantitative. Like a lot of times you have different tools, like you have, I don't know, win-loss ratios, you have feedback from sales, feedback from customer support, feedback from user interviews. NPS survey feedback, and it's even like around how do you already put all this feedback more or less together, how do you make it available for all the different teams, how do you analyze it, and how do you make decisions once you've synthesized all that. And in this case it's really a lot about like the quantitative and qualitative coming together.
Yeah, so it's about fusing those two together, and sometimes you might find that it's quantitative is identifying the question, qualitative is then trying to answer it, and then the solution might even go back to quantitative again. So it's kind of supporting each other. No, yeah, I think that's a really nice way to think about it. Thank you. Mike, keen to get your perspective on this question around the quantitative and the qualitative and the balance and the use of both and how you fuse them together.
Sure. I think for me, it really depends what question you're asking. If you're asking a question who or when, it's usually a quantitative question. If you're asking how or why, it's usually a qualitative question. Or it's easier to answer it in the qualitative way, and the first one is in a quantitative way. I think the balance changes from industry to industry. I used to work in enterprise SaaS. I had 200 customers. I could call all of them to get qualitative questions answered, like what's wrong with our product, or where you're failing, or how can we improve it. But then if I wanted to know who else could be a good customer for us, what other industries, sub-industries, and so on, how should we expand our ideal customer profile, I had to go to quantitative measures and do external survey and analyze that. Now, in a company where we have 50 million monthly active users, I tend to start from the quantitative side, because I need to figure out who I need to ask the question. So, you start and, for example, see, okay, there's a problem, and the problem might be with our users who are in India, who start by trying to compress their document. And that gives me a good feeling for who I need to recruit to actually understand what problem they are having and why they are struggling. But yeah, I tend to simplify it to 4 questions, and 2 of them tend to be quantitative, 2 of them tend to be qualitative.
Yeah, it's a really good kind of shorthand almost to start off with. I really think that's really useful. And I think it brings us quite nicely on to another question that I wanted to raise as well, which is, as you said, Mike, if you've got 200 customers, you can ring them all, you can speak to them all, but you might not necessarily be able to do everything that all of them want, and that brings in this idea of prioritization. And obviously, in an ideal world, we'd act on every single piece of feedback, but we ultimately know that in reality we have to prioritize within our roadmap. So I'm keen to ask you all how you determine, which feedback you need to act on urgently, which feedback should be tackled later, put it in the backlog, come back to it at another point. So maybe Alex, would you mind kicking us off on that one?
Yeah, of course. So I think I always start with the impact, thinking about the impact. So you get all these different feedbacks, but basically trying to put into perspective how many people gave the feedback, what clients were those, like, is it your core target or not? Is it the most impactful segment that you're trying to focus on right now? How much is worth in terms of impact on the revenues and so. And of course, it really needs to go when you think in terms of impact also on your objectives. Like, it needs to be linked to your objectives. Like, for example, I know if you want to improve activation above all, you prioritize most of the feedback that will influence activation. I think it also depends where the feedback comes from. Like, a lot of times there are a lot of tensions also with support tickets, and what I've seen working pretty nicely is like in my previous company, for example, we created like a system on kind of the different criteria, which was done in a first hand by support, which were because they knew really well the clients and they knew the impact on the business, and so they would already make a first filter on all the different tickets that came, and it was more like mostly like linked on some formulas and criteria. So it was most of the times objective. Of course, it's not perfect, and you will sometimes have some fires, but it needs to be more like the not a rule, but more like the exception. And that's something that I've seen working in some cases pretty nicely before it comes to products. So it's already it's more or less filtered before it comes.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. Thank you. And it reminded of Mike's previous answer, actually, in terms of the who, the what, the why, the how. So, Mike, do you approach that in the same sort of way? Do you start in terms of prioritization? Do you start with who is it from? Are they our core users? Are they key accounts? Are they high value? Is that how you would tackle it too, Mike? Starting from that who's it from perspective?
I think it's one of three perspectives that are very important. So yes, definitely, who is it from? I would say, who is it from and how many are affected, right? Because it's also like you can have one very valuable customer, but it's just one, right? And they really want a custom feature, and then you have to make a decision whether you want to be in a business of outsourcing or in the business of building a platform. So it's not only who, but also how many of them. I think the second one for me is of course the level of impact, right? It's a one thing to, and I think Sam used kind of a nice comparison when he said something that could be a nice usability improvement for one group is necessary for the other group to actually be able to complete what they are trying to do. And I think that's really the big difference, right? Am I blocking you from trying to achieve what you're trying to achieve on my platform? Or are you wasting 5 minutes in the process? Because those two will act very differently. And I think there's also the third model, which comes from a very, very old model for prioritizing called Kano model, where they split features essentially into what was called hygiene, performance, and differentiation. And the point was you always work on hygiene. Hygiene is what everyone expects to have. So if you have a car and someone complains the car is too slow, but the car doesn't have wheels as well, you don't work on the engine, you first put the wheels. It's as simple as that, right? But quite often people forget about it, and you go to platforms and, I'm not going to name them, but there's quite a few large platforms that, for example, as they grew, they became so slow that they became unusable. But the speed was not a differentiating factor, and you don't really see the speed when you're buying the platform. So they didn't really have motivation to improve that speed until the speed became so bad that customers started churning in large groups, at which time they had to usually do an entire rewrite. So, to some extent, the hygiene is the most important, right? If it takes 10 minutes for me to load your HR platform, so I can enter, details of my last interview, I'm probably going to stop using it. Then you get to performance, which are things that really help you achieve the job better. And finally, there are things that I cannot do with anything else, which is differentiation. And I think it's really important because I'll be very honest. When I was young, and I see a lot of young PMs, I always run for differentiation because differentiation is cool. Everyone pats you on the back. They say, "Hey, you've built something no one else built." Right? You can showcase something to management, and they are very, very happy because there is something unique that no one else had. But then your page takes 10 minutes to load, and you should be fixing that first. So I would say that's kind of my third angle to look at it.
Yeah, Dylan, it sounds like that resonates with you.
Yeah, it's bringing back a very old memory from when I was, an individual contributor, just product manager at Google, working on search, and we had a ritual every week called Launch Calendar. And as a PM, you would go there to essentially get the green light to launch your feature or your product. And we had a latency czar. And basically, if what you were introducing crossed the threshold, of latency with regards to the search results page load, like no go. It didn't matter how great your feature or product was. And I think that, that illustrates this idea about having, product principles, which is a little bit analogous to Mike's example between the engine and the tire. Right, because no matter how great the engine was, if you don't have tires, it doesn't matter. And I think that was the same principle here with the latency czars. Like, it doesn't matter how great your feature is, if it increases the page load time past a certain threshold, it doesn't matter. So that example really resonates. I think for me, in my current, and by the way, I would answer this question lots of different ways depending on what the context is. Right, I think, whether it's consumer or enterprise or, all the other variations, you might have a different answer. For the current context that I'm in, what we do, just one example is we review the weekly report from our customer experience team, and we've kind of broken down. We have this framework, again, it's based on the funnel. It's called life cycle of the order. So it starts from, when a customer is kind of like entering or the top of the funnel, and every step that has to happen in order for the order to reach the customer. And then we'll basically look at the feedback that we're getting from customer service to try to understand where the feedback shows that there's a problem in the funnel. And then we can kind of have a relative understanding of how important that piece of feedback is. And to some degree, we'll use that to help us prioritize, which problem we're going to solve based on the feedback that we're getting from customers or feedback that we're getting from the system. So again, not to sound like a broken record, but it's the framework that kind of helps us answer a lot of these questions.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And Sam, keen to get your perspective on this this prioritization question. It kind of links in, I guess, to what you were saying earlier. So how would you approach that? How would you approach, what's urgent, what can be tackled later?
I think one of the things that comes to mind for me is just how much this really means that it is important for us to be collecting not just quantitative feedback, but the qualitative feedback. And when we collect qualitative feedback, making sure we're doing that through the lens of user research and through the lens of meeting with users and watching users use things and understanding what they're doing it and how they're doing it. Because I know we've probably all had the experience of the one customer who files every single bug as critical. And who says that every single little thing is a major impact that is stopping them from getting anything done. But when that happens, it's often that either they haven't understood something about our product or we haven't understood something about them and about their use case. And so to me, oftentimes the first step in prioritizing features is understanding why. Why does somebody want that? And how is it going to impact what they do? Because sometimes when we understand why somebody wants something, in consultation with them and in discussion with them and in the kind of inclusive design process, we sometimes realize that people are using our products in a way that we hadn't intended. We sometimes realize that our customers don't understand our products, and that's something that we need to fix. And we sometimes find that when we're talking to them about why, the thing that they believe they want sometimes isn't the thing that they actually want, right? And so if we want to really effectively prioritize and develop the features that make the most impact, we need to have a laser focus on the why of what we're doing. And when we're thinking about that impact, we also, I think, need to get away a little bit from thinking about how many people it will impact and thinking about how much impact it will have. If you save one person 10 hours or you save 10 people 1 hour, you've still saved 10 man hours across a team, right? And so if we move away from thinking about impact in numbers of people and find other metrics to think about our impact, I think we'll have an easier time prioritizing features. And I think that we'll also find that we have an easier time figuring out how to collect and use the qualitative data that I think to this day some of us in our organization still struggle with, right? Because it can be very easy to get focused on quantitative, on a single number in a dashboard that you can measure to the expense of all else. And I think we've all seen products that have been developed that way and have maybe not necessarily been a joy to use because the metric we care about is not the metric that the company developing the product cares about.
And what about ease of use? Like, how can we use feedback to ensure that users find the product simple to use, can use it? If they've got accessibility issues, they're still able to make use of it. How can we go about that?
So I think it's about changing the way that we think about accessibility. because we tend to think about accessibility as a group of people who are off to the side. They're like, a small group of people. Maybe we don't even have any users with disabilities. I don't know. Is this really worth it? And so we tend to sort of think of accessibility as a particular lens that we look at our product prioritization through. Whereas we need to change the way we think about accessibility so that we are looking at accessibility as part of everything we do, not just as, one thing that we consider, because accessibility, everything that we do is going to have an accessibility effect, whether it's implementing that chat system, making it easier for everyone to use and making it accessible to the deaf, whether it's making sure that our videos, have captions and that our video player fully supports captions, making it easier for folks who need that, but also making it possible for those of us who can't have the sound on right now to enjoy a video, whether it's adding alt text for screen readers that is also really improving the search engine optimization of our pages. Everything that we do is going to have an accessibility effect for good or bad. And so we need to realize that probably every single person listening to this call has some kind of accessibility need, though it may not be, a full-time permanent disability like being completely blind. Perhaps you have a current medical issue. Perhaps, as I am right now, you have a bit of a cold and you've taken some cold medicine and that affects your cognition, or whatever it may be. All of us have needs that can be solved through the lens of thinking about people with disabilities and through the lens of thinking about accessibility. There's a quote that I use often, which is that when you design for the edges, you get the middle for free. Because we tend to think about people with disabilities, we tend to think about accessibility as edge cases, and so we design for the middle, and then we find that, we've left out all these edge cases. Whereas when you design for the edge cases, you find that not only have you taken care of the middle, but that you've made a better, more joyful, more customizable, more adaptive experience that is easier to use for everyone. And so instead of just thinking about looking through that lens of accessibility every once in a while, we should try to think about the accessibility and ease of use and access connotations of everything that we do. And I think when we do that, we'll find that accessibility causes us to want to do and to do better at all of the things we already should be doing.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting perspective. And I think seeing accessibility as something that can improve your product across the board, rather than this is an additional that we need to do for certain users, approaching it like that, I think is a really interesting way to do it. And you can imagine, you gave two great examples there, but you can imagine the benefits that would have. And it's got a holistic way to approach using feedback for your product. Did anyone have anything else they wanted to add on kind of like how you use the feedback holistically to improve things for all users rather than particular segments?
Yeah, I think it's like that I'm adding on what Sam was saying. I think it's really interesting to think about this very early. Like it's not something that is marginal, but really think about it from the beginning when you design. And in the last years, I've been giving a lot of talks about cognitive biases, but there are a lot of times teams do have biases of not including certain groups of their users without even realizing it. And I think that's that's a blocker in some cases for teams to actually get that feedback and get it early on in order to be able to really design with that in mind. So it's really, really important whenever we go into talking to our clients to make sure that we talk with a wide array of our clients and we take all different perspectives into account. And also, I think it's very interesting how we see accessibility, and also as Sam and Mike were saying, like kind of enlarging the view on this. For example, we were like, if we think only of like internet connection, like I've worked in companies like, for example, for e-signature, like charging documents, it's very linked to your internet connection, or for Aircall, it was cloud-based telephony. So a lot of times, some of the feedbacks we were getting from clients were linked to the quality of the calls, which could a lot of times be on the side of their connection, but there were a lot of actions that we were taking as well in order to improve that and make it way more accessible for our users. So, and I think a lot of times it kind of comes to the point where some clients would start churning, that we start seeing that and seeing that as part of accessibility. So adding the definition and widening up the points of view is really important as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that. And I thought that was really interesting. The I don't know if Mike or Dylan, if you wanted to jump in on that, or we can. I know I'm conscious of the time, so if not, we can move on to the next question. Yeah. So the next one that I wanted to tackle, and we will come on to some of these audience questions. That's why I'm conscious of the time. I want to get as many of those in. There's some really good ones in there, so do add yours as well. But my next question was just around, the occasions that there is going to be tension between what is perceived as best for the customer and what is perceived as best for the business, and how those tensions can be overcome and how they can be balanced. Mike, maybe you want to jump in first on that one.
Sure. Yeah, I think it's surprisingly a very, very common sort of tension. I think it's I quite often hear be customer centric and everything will be solved. But then when I ask our customers what they would like, is they would like a product to be free, to have all the features available all the time, and preferably with 24/7 customer support available through all channels. And obviously someone has to pay for it. So there's a question of how do you actually balance all of those elements together, and what do you do there? On the other hand, if you push too much towards the business, it's also very clear that at some point of time your customers will leave and go somewhere else. So it's really, really important to strike the balance and understand where the balance is. I think it's also what complicates situation is the sort of the non-homogeneous customer base. Let me put it this way. So to give you an example, what is a good price for, let's say, Google Suite? What is a good price for Google Suite? I mean, you can get it for $6, right? Which is very cheap. It's actually, like, if I think about it, it costs less than a latte in Switzerland. So I can have all those amazing products, Gmail, editing, forms, G Drive for $6. Awesome. Now I travel to Indonesia. 4% of people have a credit card. Even less can afford to pay $6 for a product. $6 is incredibly expensive for a lot of people. So how do you find the balance? How does Google make sure that people in Indonesia can actually run businesses, write their documents, and send them over? And the reality is that at some point of time, you're making a decision and you're essentially saying certain people who are not my target audience. And it's a nice way of saying certain people simply will not get access to my product because they cannot afford it, because I'm not going to invest into that type of accessibility that that particular group needs, or I will not eliminate another barrier. And I think that's kind of something that is very complex to decide on, because there's the human side and there's the business side, and you're trying to serve both, and you need to find sort of the compromise where definitely there will be someone who will be unhappy. And there's definitely someone who will think you're leaving money on the table. And in the end, you have to decide, how much you are, let's put it, mission driven versus business driven, and where exactly that balance point is. And to be honest, quite often that is through just doing a lot of experiments to really understand how people respond to different friction elements, like the example that Jonathan gave in questions, where you experiment with price to understand what's acceptable, what's not acceptable. But in some cases it works vice versa, and I can share a story without naming the person. But when I was at Typeform, one of the early investors of Typeform shared with me that his entire company shares one Typeform account, and 300 people are using the same account, paying Typeform $30 a month. And I was like, okay, but you're our investor, right? Can you afford it? Of course I can afford it, but you're not enforcing it. So why would I pay? right? And that's also an element where you kind of, you have sort of some people who will say, okay, if you're not forcing me to pay, then I will not pay, and you cannot rely on my goodwill. And essentially, I don't think there's like an answer that I could say, yes, do this. You just have to experiment a lot and find the sweet spot where you can satisfy as many people as possible and create this positive momentum, but at the same time, make sure that you're meeting your business targets. Because to be honest, in the current environment, when you're not meeting them, we're also seeing what's happening in the technology industry, right? So that's kind of the other outcome of not being business driven.
Yeah, absolutely. Dylan, did you want to pick up on that?
Yeah, like I think it's interesting because if you think about it, you could say that if 300 people are able to use the product from one login, like there's something missing, right? Like the 300 people are not realizing some sort of benefit that they could get by having individual accounts. I mean, it's to say, I remember back when Netflix was shipping DVDs, I ran into one of the executives at the company at a party, and I was like, oh my God, I love Netflix. It's great. I have these 3 DVDs. They've been sitting on my desk for a month. It's so awesome. I don't have to pay any late fees. And he was like, oh my God, no, you're our worst customer because you're not getting the benefit, like the real product that we're trying to ship. And so it was an interesting insight into kind of like, oh, wait a minute, like actually, what I thought I was doing by like getting this great benefit of not having to return the DVD until I got around to it, I was actually not realizing the true benefit of what they were trying to ship. And so I think that's you kind of flip the problem on its head a little bit. But I think, Jonathan's question is it brings back another memory. When I was at Yahoo and I managed the identity platform, the Yahoo login page was something that I managed. And when I walked into the company, I noticed that we were logging users out every 12 hours. Like the auth session cookie would expire. So it would force you to log back in. I was like, this is the stupidest thing I've ever seen. So I found out whatever engineer, managed it. And I said, change this to, 90 days or something like that. And so we changed it. So then I got a nasty phone call from our head of sales who just said, hey, there's an ad on the login page and you just crushed my CPM. And I'm like, okay, but that's your problem. Like our customers don't like logging in every 12 hours. It's a huge pain in the ass. And by the way, if you piss off the customers, your ads are going to be seen by nobody anyway. And so, we had this tug of war, and to your earlier point, you have to find some sort of balance there. But like, I think, you have to have a hard line on where your principles are around, whether you're trying to identify the actual end user, like, are they more important than the advertiser who's playing for space there? And it's obviously, there's a sweet spot that you have to find. But, ultimately, if you piss off your users, then you're just shooting yourself in the foot by serving them ads every day. So I don't think there's a binary answer to it. I think you have to really understand what the value is that you're delivering to the customer, and really optimize for that sweet spot.
Absolutely, yeah. I think that's definitely coming through. That it's not a binary. It's you've got to balance it. It's some fine art, I suppose. And the question from Jonathan there, just to parade it out. So the question was, how do you balance features that may be perceived as a negative experience but lead to better conversion or retention? So an example would be loading screens that may lengthen time to value, but lend a perception of complexity and authority. Sam, Alex, I don't know if you wanted to jump in on that, kind of how do you balance that question?
So I did, and I think sometimes the thing that can happen when we are looking at these questions as kind of a zero-sum game, as in either the customer wins or the business wins, we're not necessarily understanding either the business mission or the value offer that we are offering, because design and product management, these are one of the few places where sometimes, very often, if we put in a little bit of thought, everyone can win. I think a great example of this that I encounter in my daily life is I use the Audible app, that's made by Amazon, and they don't really seem to have a problem with password sharing. And the reason that they don't is because Audible syncs what books you're currently reading to the cloud. It syncs what place you're at in those books. And so if you pick it up on your PC or your phone or your smart speaker, it's going to remember what you were reading and it's going to start you where you left off. But of course, if you share your account with somebody else, that's all going to get messed up and it's not going to work. So I think that's a really good example of a way that a company stopped a behavior they didn't want, like account sharing, by adding things that the customer does want, like the ability to pick up and read their book wherever they may be and have the book they were reading remembered and the place they were at remembered and all their bookmarks and all their notes and all that stuff. And so I think that sometimes we can often add value in ways that probably don't even cost very much to do in the long run, and that disincentivize some of those perhaps behaviors that we don't want.
Yeah, absolutely. Alexandra, anything that you wanted to add to that?
I think it's a really interesting question, and it comes around quite often. I was working with a startup, advising them a few weeks ago, and it was interesting because in order to increase their conversion, they put a payment part very early in the funnel. So the conversion was working pretty nicely for them, but actually what they realized is that clients would not continue the subscription and would not come back a second time. So in this case, they weren't actually activating the clients. Because clients were somehow paying before actually trying out the product and seeing all the ins and outs of the product, most of them were unhappy and they were very confused about what was happening, and that created a lot of friction, and actually it created a really negative impact in the end because clients would not activate, and most of them would not come, a big part of them that would not come back either. So it was interesting because at the beginning, we didn't really tackle, we started A/B testing a bit on what that experience would be if we would put the payment before and after or in different moments, but also around how do you explain to the users better what they're going to get afterwards. But I think this example was really interesting for me because on a first hand, when they worked with an agency and they did a whole funnel and they put a payment at the point that they did very early on, they were very happy because conversion was so much better. But at that moment, they didn't actually see not even that longer term effects, a few weeks later effects of the clients not being activated, being very confused, and in the end, not having the retention they wanted.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I wanted to kind of jump back a little bit because I know we kind of touched on it a little bit a few times about kind of getting feedback from prospects or potential users or target audience who doesn't convert. And I think that's relevant for your example as well there. How can we go about getting feedback from that group? Can we? How do we get the learnings from them to address the fact that they aren't converting, something wasn't quite right? How do we go about doing that? Does anyone have kind of thoughts on how we tackle that problem?
I don't know if this is...
Sure.
Oh, go.
Go on, Sam.
Sam.
I was going to say, I don't know, maybe this is specific to accessibility, but I sometimes think not. I think that very often our customer support and our feedback email addresses and telephone numbers and all of this thing can get very disconnected from our product folks and from our development folks, because often if somebody can't use the product or is unhappy with the product, especially in accessibility, they'll contact support or they'll send an email. And so we'll say, well, this doesn't work with my screen reader, or it doesn't have captions. And support sometimes will have no idea what to do with that feedback, right? They're very good at, oh, if you're having a problem with an existing feature that you've misunderstood, we'll help you through. But if you're having some kind of barrier or some kind of need that's not met or some kind of feature that's not there, there seems to be a high level of disconnect at a lot of companies between our support folks and our product folks. And I think that the more companies work on solving that, the more they're hearing these users who contacted support and didn't get a satisfactory answer and didn't convert, and maybe support had no idea what to do with their question or their problem or their feature request.
Yeah, absolutely. Mike, you were going to say something as well.
Sure. I actually think this is not very different than doing prior pre-product market fit research, because essentially it is, right? Your product is not a market fit for a certain group of people. If you have an idea who that group of people is, very easy, right? You just target them, and you can either recruit them through companies like SurveyMonkey, they might have them in the panel, or some other places, or you can go to Google and use the search engine marketing, and when they search for specific keywords, try to get them to answer a survey and give you a few answers, and so on and so on. If you don't know who those people are, then you have to do a broader market study, where you essentially go after a broader market, as you're thinking, 3,000-4,000 people, and essentially that's quant, where quant is very useful, because you might actually go and do a study of 4,000 people in a specific, let's say, customer category, and ask them what they think about different products, without disclosing that you're running the study. We've done in different companies this quite often with Qualtrics. They would do it on our behalf, and then we would read, why certain customers love this competitor and they would never try us, and why certain other customers love us and they would never try the competitor. And essentially what you need to do is just get out of the building, get out of the set of the people you're talking to every single day, and look at the broader market. But I would say, even like sort of on the start, even if you talk to your users, it's problematic, because most users who talk to you are power users, and power users have very different needs than the 90% who is not vocal. And if you build based on the feedback from power users, you're going to build a very, very complex product that at some point of time, like Adobe Photoshop, is going to be reinvented by Canva, by Figma, by everyone else who discovered that the product became essentially too many things, and you can build a simpler product and address smaller groups of people. So it's important to do this check and not just listen to the people who are the loudest, but really go after the people who are quiet, silent, and really understand what they need.
Absolutely, yeah. Alexandra, I can see you're nodding away in agreement there.
Yeah, big plus one on what Mike was saying on really understanding your different type of clients and going after them at different moments. Something like I've done a lot of B2B, and I think in B2B, of course, like we go talk to the clients directly, but also a lot of the feedback comes from sales as well. Like, for example, why they lost certain deals. And I think that's good, but it's also very important to work with the sales teams in order to structure that feedback, because a lot of times it's a bit like very high level information. It's not very actionable for products. So really making sure that they do understand, we do understand a bit more like the motivation or the context or the use case or the problem that those potential clients had that didn't stay with us. And there's a lot of work usually between product and sales teams in order to get these kind of feedback to be more like actionable afterwards for product. And I think it's also how do you, when reaching out to your clients, I think it depends a lot. Like some of them are like, for example, I was working with a company that was in the food business. Like people loved talking about food, even though they didn't stay with the company. So it was pretty easy to go and talk to clients, even if they didn't stay. And they were super open to share a lot of things. Then there are other companies that are more linked to maybe more private things that are more like we don't really want to share. So I think it really depends on the industry as well. In some industries, really cool, because it's pretty easy to go after getting feedback, even if the clients are not they did not stay with you.
Absolutely. And that kind of came from Russell in the chat there. So Russell said maybe this session should have been called Giving Our Target Audience What They Want, rather than giving the customers what they want. And how should we collect that feedback? So I think hopefully we've done a bit to answer that question for you there, Russell. If you do have any other questions, please just drop them into the chat. We've only got a few minutes left. So we're going to take one from Rick now. And Rick says, how do you ensure you give customers what they need when they don't know that they need it or they cannot articulate it within feedback? So how do you go about providing something that people might need and not even realize they need? Does anyone want to take that one first?
I'll jump in. I think a lens that I try to use in kind of this particular scenario is really understanding what the problem is as opposed to trying to solve the symptom. And so oftentimes, you know, customer feedback can articulate what the symptom is, or, you know, I'm having a problem doing this, or I can't do this. But if you'd really kind of like, you know, take it all the way back to the root cause or the problem itself and try to focus on that, I think you set yourself up for being able to do something that is not necessarily just a reaction to what's going on, but potentially doing something that solves a broader problem and potentially something that's in the future, more future looking. So it's just a lens that I've used that's been helpful in that particular scenario.
If I could build on what Dylan said, I think the sort of the formulation of a problem is really critical, not only to better sort of answer what customers could benefit from, but also because in many cases, customers, especially in B2B, are willing to tell you what feature you should build. Mm-hmm. And that essentially leads to a lot of tension because they want a feature that is very specific to them. But if you can take a step back and find the common problem that multiple customers share, then you can actually continue building your platform for multiple customers versus solving for one thing. But I think, you know, talking about, because people will say, okay, how do I know the customer has what kind of problem the customer has? And I think this is the important thing. You need to observe. This is like, we assume that talking to customers is the only way of collecting data, or surveying customers is the only way of collecting data. But some of the greatest products have been built based on observing what people do. You know, I don't know how much truth is in the story that Steve Jobs came up with iPod because he saw kids walking with Walkman and carrying 5 or 6 or 7 cassettes with them. Right? So then he saw a problem. They might not know they have a problem, but he see a problem. They're carrying 7 cassettes. Okay, that's a problem. Why not have one? Right? So be a fly on the wall. Go and engage with the business. Dog food, try it yourself. Maybe you'll actually find the problem when you are using it yourself, right? But it's really important to develop that empathy. And honestly, you cannot develop an empathy unless you put yourself in the customer's shoes and spend a lot of time with them.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think Rick approves of that one. He said boom in reference to the iPod example. So I think that definitely hit home there. Alex, Sam, did you have anything to add to that one?
Not really an extra point, because for me, the first thing that came to mind was also really going for the problem. So really understanding the problems and understanding kind of day-to-day lives of people and how they act in certain situations. I think that what's really important is how you do it, of course, because you need to do it in a very unbiased way. You do need to do it a lot around, you know, it's a lot around also how do you ask those questions or how do you observe the people instead of just going for certain types of questions. So I think it's a lot in the methodology and the way you actually listen to and interpret the information. But for me, the go-to thing is also really understanding the problem and understanding some behaviors. In some cases, it could come from some trends as well, and understanding problems links to some potential trends. But in the end, it's always about the problem first.
I mean, I think it's interesting how we in the tech sector especially are vulnerable to this, right? Because we all love new technology and new things and new code and new features. And I mean, the tech industry seems to be the industry that is especially prone to entire companies being built around solutions that are looking for a problem, right? And so we never want to be doing things backwards like that. But I think this industry especially has a history of doing that.
Absolutely. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have. We have literally like 30 seconds left. But I just want to say thank you to all of our panelists. I thought it was a really, really interesting discussion, and I'm sure we'll get good feedback about that session. So thanks for taking the time to join us and share your thoughts on that. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
And thanks to our audience as well for the questions too. We're going to go straight into the next session. When you close out this one, it'll take you back to the schedule. You'll be able to load up the next session, and there'll be a little wait while we get everything set up for you, and then we'll kick off in roughly 15 minutes or so. So I look forward to seeing you in the next session, and thank you all again.
Thanks, James. See you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.